It was a mild afternoon in San Francisco, the kind where the sun shone brightly enough to drive away any breeze. The city seemed to breathe calmly, as if time had slowed down for a few moments. On the charming and winding Lombard Street, in front of the cozy sweet coffee, a discreet café beloved by locals, a man was sitting alone at one of the outdoor tables. He was wearing sunglasses and a hat that cast a shadow over his face, but it was still impossible not to recognize him. Clint Eastwood, the living legend of cinema. The years had softened the contours of his face, but his presence remained imposing. Every now and then, a pedestrian would glance in his direction, recognizing him at a glance, but hesitating to approach. There was something sacred in that moment of solitude, as if even the curious knew that, in the presence of a figure like him, silence was also respect. Curious to know what happened next? Don't miss the next moments of this exciting story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep up with everything. Across the street, however, there was someone no one seemed to notice. His clothes were layered, worn by time and the elements. Each piece spoke of cold nights, hard sidewalks, and dreams left behind along the way. His disheveled hair framed a tired face, and in one hand he held a piece of cardboard with a simple message. The other hand fidgeted nervously in his pocket. His name was John, and today marked the third week he had slept behind the dumpster of a nearby convenience store. John hadn't known what a full meal was for 2 days. Hunger gnawed at him relentlessly, reminding him of the abyss his life had fallen into. As he watched the sweet coffee business, his eyes searched for anyone who looked approachable. It was then that he spotted Clint Eastwood. A lump formed at his throat. Approaching someone so iconic seemed crazy, but necessity spoke louder. He took a deep breath, hesitated for a second, and then took the first step. Have you ever felt so desperate that you would take an action you never imagined? What would you do in a moment like this? What could a man like that possibly care about someone like him? The question rang in John's mind as he stared at Clint Eastwood across the street. But hunger has a way of eating away at pride, of pushing even the most resilient to the limit. Taking a deep breath, John crossed Lombard Street with heavy steps, as if each one carried the weight of the past few years. Do you think people are more willing to help in times of desperation? Have you ever helped someone when they needed it most? His voice came out almost as a whisper as he approached the table where Clint was. Sir, could you spare me $1? Clint looked up slowly, calmly removing his sunglasses. His expression was unreadable, and for a moment, John was sure he had made a mistake. Maybe he had crossed a line. Maybe he would be chased away like on so many other occasions. But then Clint leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on John, as if trying to decipher a puzzle with pieces scattered and dirty over time. Do you think Clint would do the same thing if he were someone different? What would you do in his place? The silence stretched out for a few seconds that seemed eternal. Anxiety burned in John's chest, and he was already preparing to apologize and disappear from there. That was when he heard the actor's voice, calm, almost neutral. $1, huh? Clint paused, letting the sentence hang in the air. Then, with a slight smile on the corner of his lips, he added, "Sit down. Let's talk." For a moment, John thought he had misheard. It sounded surreal, like one of those scenes from old movies he had watched when life still had color. Feeling like Clint Eastwood, he looked into the actor's eyes, searching for any sign of sarcasm, hoping it was just a cruel joke. But there was no mockery there, just a calm, almost gentle curiosity. It was disconcerting, and, in a strange way, comforting. With a silent, shy, "Thank you," John sat down in the chair across from him. His hand shook slightly as he placed a small cardboard sign on the table, tilting it so it wouldn't draw too much attention. He could feel Clint's gaze on him, but it wasn't hard or judgmental. It was attentive, curious, as if he really wanted to understand what was behind the dirt, the stubble, the broken voice. John wasn't used to this. Most people looked away, pretended not to see, or hurriedly tossed coins, as if trying to get rid of a nuisance. No one else wanted to hear his story. But now, sitting there, in front of someone he never imagined he would meet, the words started to come out before he could even stop them. I'm sorry if I bothered you," he stammered, his voice rough and dry. "I don't usually do this. I don't like to ask. I've been trying to find work. But it's hard, much harder than I imagined. He looked down at his hands, as if they held all the shame in the world. But Clint didn't say anything. He just listened. And for John, that was more than anyone had done for him in years. John took a deep breath, as if each word that followed had been cut through a thick fog of painful memories. The whole damn thing is, I was a contractor, he began, his voice cracking. You know, I had a team. Steady work. Stable. He paused briefly, his eyes fixed somewhere between the table and the past. Then the recession hit. The jobs disappeared. It wasn't long before the savings dried up, too. First came the late notices, and then he swallowed hard. The silence was heavy. Well, I guess you can guess the rest. He tried to laugh, but it came out more like a bitter sigh, almost hollow. Funny, huh? I spent my whole life building houses for other people. Now, I can't even keep a roof over my own head. Clint's face remained serene, but his eyes said something else. There was a silent, almost imperceptible understanding there that made John shift in his seat, as if the shame was trying to come back and envelop him again. He looked away and tried to change the subject. I know you probably get approached all the time. I don't want to be just another guy begging for money. I don't know what else to do. But Clint wasn't the kind of man who would just nod and wish him luck. There was something different about him, something John hadn't expected to find there. The actor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, their hands clasped together naturally, almost as if they were having a conversation between old friends. The air between them seemed to grow thicker, quieter, as if, for a brief moment, the world had stopped just to listen. John's heart raced. He half expected Clint to pull out his wallet, hand over a few dollars, and continue with his coffee, like others had done before. But instead came a simple question. Too simple. What's your name? John blinked, taken aback by the question. John, he murmured, his voice almost hoarse. Clint nodded slowly, as if he were absorbing the name. John, he repeated, savoring the sound as if it held some special weight. Then, after a moment of silence, he spoke. You know, John, I've played a lot of characters in my life. Cowboys, soldiers, detectives. And if there's one thing I've learned about all of them, it's that each one carries a story. Good, bad, ugly, it doesn't matter. What really matters is how they choose to carry it. Clint paused briefly, letting the words sink in. So, tell me something. What's the next chapter of your story? John stared at Clint, unsure if he was serious. His voice was shaky, filled with an almost childlike wonder. The next chapter? Yeah, Clint said, leaning back calmly. You're still here. You're breathing. You're talking. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, John felt that maybe, just maybe, the next chapter could still be written. By asking for $1, Clint said, pausing as if it held more meaning than the simple words implied, that means your story isn't over yet. So what's the next chapter? John felt a lump in his throat. He didn't have an answer. The truth was, he hadn't thought this far ahead in a long time. Surviving day to day left no room for planning for the future. What would come next? It was a question he avoided. I don't know, he admitted, his voice almost cracking. I guess I just want to get through the day. Clint took his time speaking. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in thought. He was trying to get deeper somehow. This isn't a chapter, John. This is just a sentence. You need a chapter. Something real. Something you can build on. John felt a mix of frustration and curiosity. He wanted to ask Clint what he knew about fighting, what he knew about being in a hole so deep it seemed impossible to get out of. But the question stuck in his throat. There was something in the way Clint spoke, something deeper. He wasn't just throwing out empty words, cliches that we've heard over and over. There was a genuine desire to make John think, to pull him out of his comfort zone, to something more. Clint then reached into his pocket, and for a moment, John felt his heart sink. This was the part where the money would be taken from his wallet, and he would be dismissed like so many other times. But instead, Clint pulled out a simple business card and slid across the table. Go, Clint said, his voice firm but not harsh. Here, It's a shelter run by a friend of mine. They'll help you get clean, find a job, maybe even a place to stay. But John, the decision to take the first step is yours alone. John looked at the card with shaking hands. His throat tightened, and to the feeling of being pushed into something new and scary, the question came out, Why? Why are you doing this? Clint watched him for a moment. His expression softened slightly, but the seriousness was still there. Because someone did this for me once, he said with quiet sincerity. And I wouldn't be sitting here in front of you if it weren't for that. But inside John, doubts continued to grow. He didn't know if he could believe in second chances. Not after everything he'd been through, all the times life had knocked him down and not given him a hand to get back up. John's fingers hovered over the business card, as if it were made of glass. He didn't want to touch it, didn't want to cling to an empty promise. But the name and address printed there felt like a lifeline. Still, the weight of his doubts weighed him down. Could he really trust this? John sat in silence, the weight of Clint's words hanging in the air. He glanced at the card on the table, but the doubt didn't go away. I don't know, man, he said after a long silence, shaking his head. I've tried places like this before. They don't really help people like me. Clint's gaze didn't waver. He kept his eyes fixed on John, waiting unhurried, as if he were waiting for something more. People like you? What does that mean? John swallowed hard. Try not to look Clint in the eye. It was easier to avoid his watchful gaze. You wouldn't understand. Man, people like me were just forgotten. Clint leaned forward again, his expression serious. But his tone, low and firm, still carried a soft but strong energy. You think I've never been down? You think I don't know what it's like to feel like you're carrying the weight of the world, and no one is there to help lift you up? John looked at Clint, startled. For the first time, he saw more than the actor's calm face. There in Clint's eyes was a hardness, a depth he hadn't noticed before. I grew up dirt poor in the middle of the Great Depression, Clint continued, his voice unhurried, as if it were an ancient truth he carried with him. I know what it's like to go to bed hungry, wondering if tomorrow will be better. And let me tell you something, John. He paused, and John realized the world seemed to shrink around them, as if everything were focused on those words that were about to be spoken. It's not about how hard you fall. It's about whether you're willing to get back up, even when the odds are stacked against you. The words hit John unexpectedly. He opened his mouth to retort, but found he had nothing to say. It was as if Clint's words had cut through the air, and he was unable to escape them. Clint leaned back in his chair, his tone softer now, but still filled with simple, solid truth. Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I have all the answers, Clint said, calming down. But what I do know is that life isn't fair, and it never will be. The only thing you can do is decide. Are you going to let it break you, or are you going to let it build you? John felt tears starting to sting the corners of his eyes, but he quickly blinked them away. He felt weak standing there, vulnerable, in front of a man who seemed to have everything under control. It's not that simple, he said, his voice cracking, as if reality were trying to catch up with his words. No, it's not, Clint agreed, his voice firm but with a hint of understanding. But simple doesn't mean easy. Life is hard as hell, but if you don't try, you'll never know what could have been. John looked at the card again. His mind was racing, thoughts mixed with the chill he still felt in his bones from the night spent on the frozen concrete. He felt the weight of time, of the choices that had led him there, and then, in an almost imperceptible sigh, doubt crept in again. Could he really trust Clint? Could he take that step, make that first move toward what seemed like a possibility of change? The meals John had found in the trash cans, the faces that turned away from him every day, all of it was now before his eyes, as if it were part of a distant past. But there, in that moment, was that man, a stranger, a legend, who seemed to see something in him that even he himself had lost. And what Clint said did something that John didn't know still existed inside him. It gave birth to a spark of hope. Maybe that was it. Or maybe it was just a simple fact that, for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he had anything left to lose. He was there, in front of Clint, and something was different. I'll think about it, John said, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the words were still weighing on him. Clint nodded, as if that were enough. Well, that's all I'm asking, he said calmly, in no rush to conclude anything. John clutched the business card tightly and stood to leave, uncertain, his thoughts in tatters. He didn't know what to make of it or how to feel. Clint's words echoed in his mind, awakening something inside him that he could no longer ignore. Memories of an easier time, perhaps, and the feeling that he could still try. But the doubt remained like a shadow. He took a few hesitant steps and then suddenly turned around. "Thanks for listening," he said, his voice barely able to carry over the hum of the street. Clint gave a small nod, his expression as blank as ever. Then, before turning back to his coffee, he said simply, "Take care, John." But John didn't see the slight hesitation in Clint's hand as he took the cup, didn't notice the way Clint's jaw clenched, as if he were holding something inside. Clint stood there alone and a slow sigh escaped his lungs. He looked at the empty chair where John had been moments before, and for some reason, the memory of a distant past intensified. It wasn't the first time he remembered the difficult days, but this time the memories were stronger. Clint was younger than John when he first learned how quickly life can knock you down. He grew up during the Great Depression, a time when every day was a struggle for his parents, trying to keep food on the table. There were nights when the only meal they had was a can of beans shared between them. And then there were the strangers, people who, without asking for anything in return, did something simple that made all the difference. He remembered one man in particular, a mechanic who offered him his first job. It wasn't glamorous or a job worth telling stories about. But this man made him feel something that Clint would never forget. The dignity of work, no matter how small. He saw potential in Clint, a scrawny kid, that no one else saw. And that was what made all the difference. That simple gesture changed the course of Clint's life, and he knew in that moment that he owed something to those who had unwittingly lifted him up when he needed it most. Now, sitting there alone, Clint allowed himself to feel that weight again. He looked at the empty chair where John had been moments before, and thought that perhaps it was time to give back a little of everything he had already received in life. Now, decades later, Clint has taken that lesson with him. He's built a career that most people could only dream of, but he's never forgotten where he came from or the people who helped him get there. For Clint, helping John wasn't about charity. It was about giving someone else the chance he himself had already been given. He knew the road ahead for John wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that sometimes all it took was someone believing in you to spark something bigger. Meanwhile, John walked aimlessly down the street, the card still clutched in his hand. He passed storefronts, his reflection staring back at him, tired, worn, and defeated. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a glimmer of something new. He stopped outside a laundromat, staring up at the blinking neon sign. With the little money he had left, he decided to do his laundry. If he was going to show up at that shelter Clint had mentioned, he wanted to look presentable. It wasn't much, but it was a step, and that first step would be the hardest, but also the most important step he had taken in years. John's first visit to the shelter was overwhelming. The fluorescent lights, the sound of hurried footsteps, and the constant hum of voices made him feel out of place. But the staff were kind. They didn't judge him for the state he was in. And for the first time in years, John felt like someone actually saw him, not as a problem, but as a person. Days turned into weeks, and though the road was not smooth, John began to rebuild his life. The shelter helped him get a temporary job at a nearby warehouse, where he quickly proved himself reliable and hardworking. With the money he earned, he moved into a modest shared apartment. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over his head and a step toward stability. Through it all, he thought about Clint Eastwood. He kept his business card, now worn and crumpled, as a reminder of the moment that changed everything. One night, after a particularly long shift, John sat down and wrote Clint a letter. He thanked Clint for the kindness he'd shown him that day at the café and told him about the progress he'd made. John hadn't expected a response, but writing the letter felt like closure, a way to acknowledge the man who'd given him a second chance. Months later, Clint received the letter. Sitting in his quiet office, he read it carefully, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He folded the letter neatly and placed it in a drawer where he kept other mementos from his life. For Clint, it was never about recognition or gratitude. It was about reciprocating compassion he had received when he needed it most. John's story didn't end there. Inspired by his own journey, he began volunteering at the same shelter that had helped him. He would talk to others who were struggling, sharing his story and offering the same encouragement that Clint had given him. Slowly but surely, he became a symbol of resilience and hope within his community. The café on Lombard Street, in fact, remained a quiet setting for countless passers-by unaware of the life-changing conversation that had taken place there. But for John and Clint, that encounter would always be more than just a coincidence. It was a moment that proved the power of human connection, a simple gesture that rippled in ways neither of them could have foreseen. And for those who hear her story, it serves as a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can lead to the biggest transformations. If this story touched your heart, please like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this. Together, we can spread the power of compassion and show the impact of second chances.